1 Corinthians chapter 10, we will be picking up with verse 32, which we ended with last time. But I want to drop all the way back. We'll just read. I'm not going to review the whole thing, but just to capture the tone of it, beginning in verse 23. And in doing this, I want you to recall, though, that this section actually goes all the way back to chapter 8. That in chapter 8, he began discussing this interaction, this problem of what do you do with the problem of eating something offered to idols, and that there are these choices and how does it affect. And he emphasized the need to consider other people in making your decision. Chapter 9 was all about his demonstration of the choices he had made that showed his care and interest in the people around him, because he cared more for their souls than simply for getting to do things that maybe he would have preferred or would have been easier for him. So as we turned back to chapter 10, it returned to that idea of idolatry, going back to Israel and dealing with that underlying problem of idolatry, that there are a lot of practices in the culture for them that were significant. So as we come down and we pick up in verse 14, he says, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." And he goes down to talk about why then, in that section, why even though there is nothing itself in what is offered to an idol, that we need to be aware of the temptation of, through certain practices, to be lured back in. And for these things to, again, to enter our mind and think in old ways. So having addressed all that, we begin then in verse 23, and I'll read. "All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord and all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, 'This was offered to idols,' do not eat it, for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God." Now, let's think about what he just said then. In bringing it back, all these things from all the way going to chapter 8, his point is, in the context of all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful, are these things in the context specifically, that these things he's been mentioning, there's no problem with them inherently. But there are problems with them in terms of conscience and of how you have influence. You could be affected by it of thinking that, okay, this has some kind of religious tie to it now. Somebody else who is bringing something up and they have that understanding, and therefore if you were participating with them, they think that's what you would be doing too. He says, don't do that because of their conscience, what they're going to think about you. You need to guard then, as a general rule, what he's talking about is you guard your own heart to make sure that you're not violating your own conscience, but you also be aware of what other people believe and not give people the impression in your interactions. It may be fine on its outset, but you have an obligation. If they think something that their interpretation of what you're doing is wrong, you don't need to do it, because that creates the wrong impression of you and right and wrong for them as you're moving forward. So that's the key element moving forward in all this. So what do? You ought to keep God's glory in mind, and that is a reference to the quote 2 times, "For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness." They had different things emphasized. Well, the first time is that, hey, look, all this belongs to the Lord. But the second time, it was in contrast with the idea of idolatry, in which he's emphasized it's the Lord's and that you need to honor him. So as he's putting all these things back together, he's saying your behavior in any one of these, the choice should be what best honors God fulfills his will, and demonstrates your dedication to him in showing that you honor him first. That's what you need to be thinking. And now he, in verse 32, which we closed with last time, he cites the realm in which we're dealing with here. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. Now, when he says give no offense, he's kind of summing up what he just went over. That is, and we have to kind of go over it today because the idea of offending somebody has reached such silly levels that we have to have a discussion. I mean, it's one of those things where if I happen to look at you the wrong way and in your mind you imagine I thought something bad about you and that offended you and that's somehow my fault because I have a funny look on my face, that's about you, then that's different. He's talking about things that are within your control that you choose to do. That whatever your actions and behaviors are within your control, those you need to be aware of how people see it. And not give offense, but that word offense is the idea, if you'll check carefully, of putting something to stumble where they will spiritually, they will be caused a problem because of you. That's the context. Not whether or not they get upset. It's whether or not by observing you that you've created a problem that if they follow you but they have the wrong understanding, they're going to do something wrong. That you put something in their way that for them now is a temptation because you chose to do it. Okay. So the whole idea is going back to remember, he's disclosing now for them what he said about himself in all of chapter 9. Is I'm going to hold back on some of these things, and he had given examples of how he done that already, because I want people saved. And I do not want to be the reason why somebody is not saved. Now, did you hear what I just said? How many times in our behavior and our choices are we thinking more in terms of, I have the right to do this, there's nothing wrong with it, versus, if I do this, how might it affect someone else's salvation? See, in the first, we're only considering our own. This is good, I'm fine, it's allowable. The whole point of this section is you should be thinking not just about your own salvation, but about the salvation of those around you. And that ought to be a major consideration for how you conduct yourself, how you behave, what you are talking about with them, and that you make sure that you're putting them first. So with that in mind, when he says that you don't give this an offense, you don't offend in that way, notice the categories, either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. Now why those three categories? What does that tell you about the nature of the problem? Louder, please. It's in all three areas. It can be any one of these. Okay, what are the distinctions he's making? Because you've got a congregation that are Jews and Greeks. Okay, that's basically Jews and everybody else. But then he says, the church. Well, they are the church too. So what is he really having them think about and considering, having given the principle of you need to be mindful of everyone else in what you're doing? Not everyone's on the same level, or does it affect in the same way? There are certain things, that behaviors that are not going to, within this category, okay, it's not a big deal over here. You're a Jew, that's not a big deal. But for a Greek, a Gentile, pagan, it may be a very big deal because of their background. And he's talking, remember, he included in this earlier portion both those who were Christians and non-Christians. And so he's saying you need to be mindful of people regardless of the culture. You need to be sensitive to the culture and how people in different cultures are interpreting what you do and how what you do affects them. As well as then, he says, in the church and out, that there are different categories, Jew, Greek, and in the church. Why? Because and we talked about this a little bit, that we really ought to be better about recognizing the church should have its own culture. Okay, and we'll develop that. John? Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that's good. Matter of fact, John mentions Ephesians 4. I draw it back all the way to verse 25. And the 25 through 32 at the end of chapter 4 of Ephesians, because there are specific behaviors he talks about in that chapter. Similarly, and he's talking within the framework of the church there, but things that can undermine unity, practically speaking. Because the whole thing he's been working on, talking about unity, and then verse 17 through 24 is your old life. And that's basically verses 25 through 32. He gets down to some really specific, pointed applications to say, these are the kind of things you've got to get out of your life now because they hurt your relationship with your brethren. So if you look at just specifically to the church here in this point, I think you could put a little reference looking right back at that and saying, these are the kind of things, now those were directly sinful. Here he's not talking about things that are directly sinful, but about things that could cause a problem, even though they're not. So it's kind of that next level up. Remember, we talked about the question we had to ask is not just, is it sinful? Not just, so that's first thing, is it wrong before God? But also then, okay, is it authorized? Good, you need to ask that question. But then you say, is it best? We don't want to have the responsibility of asking that next question. Is it the best thing to do? The best thing? Because that's we have to think a lot harder about things when we do it that way. Is this the best thing for me to do, considering everyone around? And it just recalls you have to know people, right? Sometimes we hurt people innocently because we don't know them. Well, what's the answer for that? Getting to know people, right? Keep your mouth shut. That's the first step. Okay. Don't make everyone laugh when you say that. Yes, no, it is, you're right. Is that you have to learn to say, okay, I'm not going to say that here. You're right. But, and I think all of us, let's all not pick now. We all have this problem, right? This is not an individual problem of saying, we've got to learn to say no. I'm not going to go there. And so we have to figure that out. Now, he's going to look at verse 33 now. We're going to keep building on this. Even as I also please every man in all things. Right? He says, I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Sometimes we get thrown by that word profit because in our minds we hear the word profit and we're thinking money. Paul's not interested in what their bank account is here. Now is he? That's clear from the end. What is he concerned about? Their souls. Are they going to be saved? So the profit he has in mind then of what's to my advantage, and this is the concept of what makes it easier on me, what's best for me. It's not just about what's best for me, but what's best for the most people. I've got to be considering all that. Why? That they may be saved. So my consideration, he's just pulling all this together, is in pleasing all men. It's not my job is to make everyone happy, okay? Right? Try to do that sometime because it's actually impossible to do. You can't make everybody happy, right? So that's not the aim. But as far as what he's trying to get across, his aim is, how do I do the best I can for everybody for the benefit of their souls? Now, you can teach the truth that will always be for the benefit of their souls. But let's give an example. Let's build on what you were saying, though. How you do that, the things you say to some, depending upon how much they know and where they're coming from, is going to be different. Sometimes you just don't go there yet. You hold back. They're not ready. And you have to say, okay, we don't need to go there. Sometimes we may need to make an application. They're not even to the point of understanding why yet. So what do I need to do? I need to take more time to make sure they're ready for it. Okay? But in general, this is for life. This is how we need to do in basic interaction of making sure that how does what I'm doing have an impact on that person's soul? Now remember what we said of putting this all together, and then he's still been talking about this, and he spent all of chapter 9 talking about his own examples. Now let's take a look at chapter 11, verse 1. He says, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. The reason why he can say that here at the beginning of chapter 11, which is the last thing actually in this paragraph, and this one of those unfortunate chapter divisions. Okay. Rule number 1, never divide up chapters while writing on an animal. That's the rule you ought to get from this. But okay, every once in a while we slip, put it in the wrong spot. He's closing it off. He'd already shown them, here's how I do this. And so this latter portion, the really second half of chapter 9, has all been about you should do the same. And let's think about what he is doing here also as a teacher. By the way in which he's done it, he's saying, and he's shown them, I'm not asking you to do anything I'm not requiring of myself. That's really important. He took the time, which seemed odd. Remember, we talked about it at the time. Why is he going into all this in chapter 9? He took all this time to lay out his behavior, but he had a long game in mind. He showed them his own example of what he was doing so that he could come back after having pled with them, developed the idea, helped through his own example to get their minds thinking in the right kind of framework, to then say, you need to do this too. This is not just an apostle thing. This kind of behavior is not just for preachers. This behavior, this emphasis, this interaction should be the norm for all Christians. So that being said, what will it take for us to get better at this? It does no good for me to stand up here and talk about it several weeks if we don't have a plan. You need a plan to apply it, plan to implement it, to make it real. Because at some point, this has to be something the way I think. So what does that take for us to do? What do you have to do? Now I got everybody at once. Good. Okay. Tracy says we have to invest time in it, right? You have to spend time thinking about it. You have to raise awareness about yourself. Self-awareness is a thing we need to sometimes work on. How do you come across others? Some people don't even know, right? You don't know how you affect others or how they see you. And sometimes I have to spend time trying to analyze it. That's my approach. Aren't you glad you're not me? Trying to figure this out. What do they mean by that? I don't understand. Awareness. And then it's being willing, humility, and love, valuing that person spiritually enough to make that an important part of my decision. That I care enough about you that I choose what I do based upon you, not me. Does that sound like a challenge? Yeah. So we look at the end of verse 11. Even as I also am of Christ. What I just described, what Paul was just describing, can we not recognize? Isn't that the whole of Christ coming to this earth? Everything he did was about what we needed for our salvation. Everything. Once he hear his mindset, now he's going to do God's will, right? And that's how we need to be. We're going to do God's will ourselves. Next step. What do I do to help other people do that and go to heaven? Jesus wants to go back, and did. And from there, how do I get everybody else to do the same? And that's what we ought to be doing. That's what we ought to be imitating. You know, I think we quote this. I certainly quoted this passage many times, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. And the principle still stands. It's just, I think when we go down and we think about the background and the context, it's even stronger. How far are we willing to do to, what are we imitating? He actually has something very specific in mind. Okay. I don't have the sheets out for this, but they are prepared, so I will get those printed. Let's talk now about the transition into verse 2. Because verses 2 through 16 is a new section. Okay. And this is perhaps one of the most difficult passages in the Bible. So right now, if you don't believe me, I want everyone to look over at Caleb. He's excited, he's grinning, he has his evil professor kind of look going on right now. He's preparing to ask me questions, just to mess with me. Which is only fair, because I did that to him for 2 years at least. But one of the big questions we have to ask about this is where it sits. Okay? As I tell the guys all the time, the structure of the text matters a lot more than we think. Where this falls within 1 Corinthians makes a big difference. So there are going to be a number of questions that have doctrinal implications because of this text. So what I want to do, because of the time, I think it'll work right, I'm going to read the entirety of this section. And as I do that, and you can follow along, just see, you can do it in your mind, you can write them down, about how many questions you have as we roll through this text. Okay? 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no custom, nor do the churches of God. So what do we do when we come to this passage? We come to verse 16, we says we have no custom, nor the churches of God. And we say, okay, good, doesn't matter, verse 17. That is typically kind of how it's approached, okay? Because if you're going to approach a passage such as this, one of the things you need to do is you need to realize an important question that we go over in one of our exegesis courses. What do I not know that I need to know? You recognize that one, Tanner? That is actually the problem. If you just go through and you're reading through this text and you have no background, you never have given any thought, then what should you think be the natural understanding if you're just reading through the text? Put a hat on, ladies. If you're just going through a basic reading, how do you not come away with that impression? And that's typically what people ask me about when we come here. But it's more complicated than that. And let me suggest why I say that, and why I say that with confidence that that's not the conclusion you should draw. So I'm going to make a statement here about how I think we need to understand the big section here, and how I think it's misunderstood, and why its placement here matters. I believe what you have here is a final application of the principles he's been studying since chapter 8. And once you realize that that's what he's doing, then everything falls into place once you have just a little bit more information. Now, why does that matter? Well, it really makes a difference because when verse 17, it introduces problems about the Lord's Supper. And he is talking there, if we look ahead, when you come together as a church, right? That's verse 18. Introduction of the problem, you're coming together, assembly. Some people, matter of fact, I'd say many people want to take this section here and place it in association with what follows and make it about being in the assembly. But that isn't actually what's addressed here. Why do they do that then? Because of verses 4 and 5. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. So we're talking about praying and prophesying. So where do we pray and prophesy? People say, in the assembly. And this is part of the problem. Is that the only place you're praying, people? What kind of heathen are you? Okay? But prophesying, say, well, that'd be different. Yes, it is. But it also is something that doesn't just occur within the assembly. One of the things that gets me about this is it actually betrays an attitude that the only spiritual activity, times we're taking in spiritual activity, is in the assembly. What a huge assumption. Okay? The other thing that what it creates is it automatically, and you'll see this discussed in commentaries, is, okay, we got this in the assembly, but now we've got women prophesying in the assembly, but we've also, just a few chapters later, in 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35, Paul says, no, women can't do that. Well, make up your mind, Paul. Paul's not the one that's confused. It's everybody else that is trying to interpret this as being an assembly that are confused, because it doesn't say that. Okay? And because of that, we actually miss something that is really positive about what he is saying. Because we end up arguing about the wrong thing rather than showing what he's doing and why. Okay? So now, with that context there, we consider what the background also is. Now, there's a little bit of speculation on this, and this is because it's very difficult, trust me, I've tried, to get specific information about practices that are solely about Corinth when it comes to some of these things. Meaning, if you look at the different sources we have in ancient history, it involved wearing something of where you'd put something on. it can come from a lot of different places. The same thing has to do with if a woman were to be shorn, okay, shaved her head, of why that would be done. Okay? For example, there are two different possibilities that I've seen within the literature. And the problem is, you know, you do realize that ancient history covers a whole lot of territory. You know, it's you know, with someone talking about the nature of an election, talking about the 2024 election in history and talking about the 1980 election in history are not going to be the same conversation, right? And they were a whole lot closer than what our sources are to the first century here, okay? But the one idea of what would happen would be that shaving a woman's head was punishment for adultery. That was one application. The other application that is probably closer home to Corinth itself, if we understand the nature of the city. And we have to go a long way back to remember this. But Corinth as a city had a little bit of a feminist vibe to it. It had some history about women stepping up, even in, they go back and the Spartans would talk about it a little bit. But had a strong culture due to, I believe we can say this, due to the cult that they had there, which was, which one? Not Diana. That's Ephesus. This is Aphrodite. Just a touch different, okay? Little more on the sexual side than Diana is, and that played into this a little bit, and that therefore they had, and you'll get every once in a while you'll have interesting conversations where, and you have to watch the literature among scholars, because sometimes they are afraid of, they want to kind of cover up certain aspects of it because of, out of, I'll call it a moral pretext. We want to protect reputation more than they think we view people down there as being way back when in low ways, and we don't want to kind of expose all that. Then we'll celebrate other things about them, which is kind of funny. Well, we don't want to talk about the cult prostitution that went with some of these things, and then recognize that that was a thing of just going through, and you had to go through, and a woman needed to actually spend a night as a prostitute before her wedding, something like that. You don't want to go through and say this is general practice, or this is, you come to this, and that was part of the nature of the ritual, and therefore prostitution was rampant. But there's also an idea of not just the prostitution, but also a courtesan, which is a little bit different kind of thing, of the heteros, different word, which has to do with a subset of women who are kind of a higher level, if you would, and that were kind of held a sway as far as, because of some of their actions in the past, were more highly regarded. Okay, but they tended to push the envelopes in terms of for recognition. Now, this is still something in dispute about whether or not one of the things that some of them would do would be to maybe shave a head. They said, why would they do that? Well, it would be an idea of appearing more manlike. And in doing so, the whole point was, we're not bound by some of these other customers, something, and you have to look at us differently, and with a higher view, more important, okay, that kind of thing. Okay, I said that the views are all over the place on this, but I wanted to get some of these out there so that when we get to the text, you'll have a little bit of background for the conversation. So we go through and we look at, and again, some of these are, I couldn't find stuff. I have books just on Corinth and trying to get, and even I have a book just on women in the ancient world, trying to find some of this information out. It's just tough. Because no one is sitting there writing a book in the ancient world and say, aren't those Corinth women crazy? You know, no one wrote that book. Or I don't know that they did, I didn't keep it. So that's kind of, we have to do our best with the ancient history. So that's, first of all, you have to know the background. So we do know enough about the nature of that cult that was prominent here, and that what he is dealing with is that they had a particular issue here with hair and being covered. And then that is kind of, it's one of those things where what all is the nature of the covering? Is it just the hair, which seems more within the flow? Is it hair plus something else? And you'll, for example, if you look at some of the iconography, some of the statues and stuff, you'll see evidence a little bit of say, a hooded kind of cloak, something like that. But it'll differ depending upon where you are in the ancient world. So now we have to rely a little bit on archaeology to be able to get some of this information, and it's varied, so we can't draw too many conclusions of that. So when you go through and you look at all of this, and that's not even the hardest part of the text to try to figure out, okay? But we have to realize what is at stake, what are the questions, but I think that it's important to frame it the right way within understanding why it falls here. And that all he's been doing is leading up to this about being willing to do things. Now think about the principle. He says, brethren, you have to be willing to sometimes not do things or do things based upon how it appears and how it affects how people see you spiritually and how it would affect them spiritually. That's what he's been doing for a long time. And now he's telling them about what they need to do in a particular situation that is essentially on that basis. Now he's going to do so, and this is what he teaches us here also is very important because he's showing us how to apply, and how do you make these decisions. It needs to be grounded in biblical principle that is solid and unchanging. In other words, that you're presenting at its core, the reason why it's a problem is what a particular thing says or might indicate to someone about how you feel about a particular problem or a situation. For example, as he starts in verse 2 and he says, "Now I praise you, brethren, you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you." That is Paul now as he's closing off. This is the end of this whole section. Okay, and he's heading into, we're going to make one big now application. So I'm so thankful that you've listened to me and you're doing what I'm asking you to do. I really appreciate that. You're good at this. You got this. Let's try another one. And that's verse 3. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. He commended them for their willingness to listen and follow instructions spiritually. And then he says this. And in today's world especially, I think people misunderstand this, abuse this, ignore this. There are all sorts of ways to respond. But I think we need to actually think about this. So I'm going to start, and that'll then give us a place to start next week. He says, but I want you to know. So he just said, okay, you do this, but there's something else you need to know. That's kind of the flow of it if you put those two together. The head of every man is Christ. Notice where he starts. The head of every man is Christ. That is, there's a responsibility for every man to acknowledge that we have to submit to Christ. That's first. And the head of woman is the man. Now he's stating this as fact and principle up front. He's going to actually give reasons later. But the point is actually the same. Submission. There is a role here. But he doesn't leave it off there. And this is really important. And the head of Christ is God. Oh, well, what does that mean then? Christ submitting to God. Messiah. Now, I want to give you a few things, ways to look at this and why it matters so much. Who is Christ? God's Son. He's God. He himself is also God. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. John 1:1. Hebrews 1:1 through 4. He also is deity and existing from the beginning with all the same attributes as the Father. But then put himself in a situation to have to submit to God. Son. And the key element here is, as we consider how this works, as a matter of fact, in John 14, at the end, he says, the Father is greater than I. Well, how can he both be equal, Philippians chapter 2, verse 6, and less than? Because one is talking about his core being and identity, and the other, his situation created by necessity. Role. Jesus is still worthy of worship because of who he really is, despite the limitations created by his humanity. And therefore, he is still, at core, equally God, but his role is different. And he then submitted to God. That is important anytime we get to explaining what it means for man to be the head of woman. Because I don't think that we've done this well. It has to do with role, not worth, not value, not something about we're saying that a woman by doing this is because she's in her place. It is simply the role that she's been given for God's reasons in the same way that Christ had a role for God's reasons to submit. And it didn't change value, importance, or identity of character, and it was not to be used as a bludgeon against somebody to act like you're a woman. That's not what this is. He's explaining the nature of how things simply are, and God has to have this kind of relationship, and that comes with some responsibilities. And that's what this is actually going to be all about. We'll pick up there next week.